Welcome to Global Tax Talk. I'm Will Morris, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Tim Power, who is currently the Deputy Director of Business and International Tax at Treasury. Tim, welcome.
Really nice to see you again.
So, Tim, you were elected the co-chair of the OECD's Committee on Fiscal Affairs, as well as the Inclusive Framework, just this past December. So I was just wondering, what are your biggest takeaways from your first 6 months in these roles?
So certainly not an easy time to have taken on the role.
No.
Not an easy time given the status of the Pillar 1 negotiations being very challenging. Not an easy time given some of the kind of external criticism that's been raised around the OECD led for in the context of the adoption of the UN resolution. But I don't think there's ever an easy time to take on this role. And it's a very interesting time, a very important time, and certainly very privileged to be able to take on the role. I think kind of what are my initial reflections? I think very different taking on a role as a chair of a committee as opposed to being a representative of the UK. I've had experience of that. I've chaired the task force for the digital economy where we were negotiating the Pillar 1 multilateral convention. And I also like to think that the UK plays a role of trying to find compromise and solutions and mediate between different positions. So I feel like I've had experience, but there's much more emphasis as a chair in trying to understand the different priorities, needs, political sensitivities of members and trying to find creative solutions. And that is tiring. It's challenging, particularly trying to get consensus amongst 140 plus jurisdictions. But I think that's what's central to the process and is what makes the outputs endure. I think second reflection, clearly there's been a lot of success in getting participation in international tax beyond the traditional OECD membership. So the Global Forum is 170 jurisdictions. The BEPS Inclusive Framework, I think, is now 147 jurisdictions. And that is participation beyond just membership. It's active participation and developing countries in particular having a real influence in terms of standards and the agenda. And I think you see that with things like the subject to tax rule and the elective approach under Amount B. I think there's an important question moving forward. We may get into it with the UN process about how we ensure that the inclusive framework remains a sustainable body for cooperation beyond the OECD membership base. And how do we ensure that working practices are such that people can meaningfully participate. It's not very easy for jurisdictions with low capacity and who don't have English as a first language to be able to meaningfully participate in a negotiation which is so fast paced, but that's something we're thinking about. Third reflection, a huge amount of work in the OECD beyond actually what gets attention in the media. There's a lot of work which isn't terribly sexy, but is kind of data, statistics, tax policy analysis, which is hugely valuable for a lot of members in terms of informing domestic policy. There's a lot of work that you'll be very familiar with in terms of common standards that the OECD owns, like the transfer pricing guidelines, the model treaty, a lot of work on dispute resolution and dispute prevention, and then a really big body of work in collaboration with other international organizations and regional organizations on capacity building. I think that has had a huge impact in the impact and implementation of standards. And then the final thing I'd say, because I really want to say it, is the OECD Secretariat themselves, I think, are amazing. I mean, it is a member-led process, but it's a member-led process that the Secretariat make happen, and they are incredibly diligent, incredibly dedicated, incredibly resilient, kind of coming up with different ideas to solve problems and seeing those ideas shot down and having to go back to the drawing board. But they do a really good job in balancing technical expertise with creativity, and I think they've really been pioneers for a lot of what's happened.
Well, thank you. There is clearly a lot going on there. So the UK has been a key member of the OECD and architect of various projects and directives regarding the pillars. There's enacted Pillar 2 already. What areas is the UK focused on with respect, you mentioned the UN before, so not just the OECD, but also the UN. And how do you think that potential divergence that you sort of hinted at before, and other regional organizations as well, not just those two, how do you think that may impact the tax landscape in the longer term?
I mean, the priorities on the international tax agenda are clearly going to be for a new government. I'd be very surprised if bringing Pillar 1 to a conclusion isn't a big priority. I hope that is a positive conclusion. I don't think people are ignorant of the political challenges within the US. But I think we have got something which I believe is a strong value proposition for the US from the perspective of the reallocation of taxing rights, the withdrawal and non-implementation of DSTs, kind of greater tax certainty. But we'll have to see where we go with that. mean, Pillar 2, there's still going to be a big focus, I think, on successful implementation. There's still a lot of work on the technical side, on the process side, in terms of qualification assessments, on the policy side, still in certain areas. I think global mobility will definitely be a focus of a new government, I'm sure. That's challenging, as I think we've heard in some of the panel discussions at this conference. I mean, there are different tax heads that are relevant here in terms of corporate tax, personal income tax, challenges with social security pensions. There are quite different fact patterns. Businesses worried about temporary working in different countries.
Yep.
Some businesses have actually built up, workforces that are entirely alienated from the place of the employer's residence. There are countries with really different geographic sensitivities in terms of the preponderance of frontier workers, etc. And there are different existing legal bases. So there needs to be, I think, realistic expectations about what the output of this project is. But I think the output can be hugely positive, I think, for businesses, but also countries. And then there are some more traditional issues, I think, that we need to make sure that we have time to focus on. Like I remember being involved in the BEPS work on the transfer pricing guidelines and the new risk control framework. And now countries go away and have to interpret what some of these terms mean. And actually, it's important that we then kind of look back and say, well, is that interpretation consistent? And if it's not, why not? And try and think through that, because that's a really important part of tax stability and certainty. I mean, the UN process, is a complication in terms of trying to fully understand the motivations of the proponents of a framework convention. And I think we're trying to work constructively and openly with them. I think we are emphasizing in those discussions the need to ensure that we complement, build on, advance the implementation of existing standards and successes rather than kind of duplicate or create inconsistencies, which I don't think is in anyone's interest from a perspective of promoting cross-border trade and investment. I also think, an important part is making sure that we look at the forums in the OECD and make sure that we are thinking about how we operate. And we've had some discussions this week about what we're reflecting on there. And I think that will be an important focus for me, I think, as a chair moving forward.
Coming back to a sort of an older UK example, we've been talking a lot about Pillar 2, and we've been talking about the guidance, and we've been talking about the complexity of the guidance, and there is of that, no doubt. But as you know very well, almost 15 years ago now, the UK enacted its own foreign profits reform, which was also very complex. But what they did in that process, in conjunction with a number of stakeholders, not just business, but other stakeholders as well, was to design what was called a gateway, which essentially was a way to allow out of the detailed impact of the rules those who they weren't intended to impact in the first place. And it really worked, I think, very successfully. So I was just wondering if you discerned any desire or willingness on the part of IF members, inclusive framework members, to try and use, let's say, safe harbors to achieve that. Because we all know what Pillar 2 is aimed at, and yet it does seem that at the moment there will be a lot of work created for, in many cases, not a huge result. So, is there the possibility of focusing it more narrowly through doing something like that?
And I think there's definitely openness to exploring simplification and administrative easement. I think you've seen that through the agreement to the transitional safe harbour. I think you've seen that through the agreement to there being a concept of a qualified domestic minimum top-up tax that benefits from a safe harbour. So a kind of exemption method, if you like, as opposed to a credit method.
Right.
I think you've also seen that with simplified rules, for example, for non-material constituent entities. So I think that there's enough evidence there to suggest that it's something that delegates are taking very seriously. In terms of the challenges, I think at this stage in thinking about permanent safe harbours is there remains a bit of uncertainty as to what the characteristics and fact patterns are that you might be appealing to in an assessment of what is a low-risk situation. And if you kind of look at the example of the UK excluded territories list, it wasn't simply a list of excluded territories. There were certain other conditions that were then attached to that.
Right.
I think you would need to replicate that here, and you would need to replicate that with the support of a significant number of jurisdictions who may have slightly different perspectives and assessment of what risks they're trying to tackle. I think the other thing is that we need, before we, act in terms of trying to provide something with more permanent status, we really need to understand what the best route is to simplification. I mean, it might well be that we spend a lot of time trying to think about when an income inclusion rule might be switched off in its application, but actually does that provide simplification of the jurisdictions it's being switched off in relation to if all implementing QDMTTs?
Right.
Maybe not. So I think there's a need to think about it very seriously, but make sure that where we act and when we act, we're doing so on a fully informed basis. Before then, there's also a lot of emphasis that we need to place on administration. There's a lot of emphasis that we need to place on dispute prevention. And I think there are different components of that. I think the qualification assessment process is a key part of that. And I think, as has been raised by a number of stakeholders here, making sure that kind of businesses are involved in that process and businesses are able to proactively identify inconsistencies in interpretation and implementation in different countries and be able to deal with that. Because the dispute resolution side is definitely something that is being explored, but it's not straightforward. And we're talking about very novel ways in resolving disputes, absent Pillar 2 being reflected in a multilateral treaty. And we'll continue to give thought to that, but it will continue to come up against some big challenges, I think, in that respect.
Good. Well, I think in the end, we all have a mutual interest in trying to make it simpler, but I understand the complications as well. Anyway, Tim, thank you very much for joining. This has been really very informative. And thank you for joining us, and come back again so that you stay global tax ready.